Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Radical Candor podcast. I'm a slightly under the weather, Jason Rosoff.
I am with the weather, Amy Sandler. You might notice Kim is not here today, so we are going to try something fun, an experiment, and hopefully this will help Jason feel a little bit better and be fun for you all. So let us know. Last week, we did an FAQ with Kim. Kim and I had a conversation where I asked Kim a bunch of frequently asked questions that she gets about Radical Candor. And Kim isn't here, but I'm going to ask Jason the same exact questions, and we are going to see how might Jason answer them as opposed to Kim. And part of why we're going to do this, asking the same questions, is because, as you know, if you've been listening to us or reading the book, etc., that Radical Candor, while at its core it means care personally and challenge directly, it's going to show up and mean different things to different people in different contexts. Jason, how might you even say that differently than how I just said it? Why are we doing this?
The way that I think about Radical Candor is more like Kim says this, right? It's sort of a compass that leads you in the right direction, but the destination, the specific destination, is going to be unique for each conversation and each person. And my goal is when I think about applying Radical Candor is to make sure that at the end of the conversation, the other person feels that they feel the care, they feel that I care about them, and they're also really clear on whatever it was that we discussed. So those are my goals, and I think the care personally, challenge directly, I tend to abstract those out to kind and clear, and that helps me. But I think other people probably think about it slightly differently. And that's okay, as long as the end result is that the other person feels cared for and understands and is clear about what the communication is that you're trying to have with them.
I find kind and clear is a really helpful proxy. And also, one of the things we'll talk about is that my intention might be that the other person feels that I have been kind and clear. They feel that I have been caring, but it might not land that way. So to that point, question number 1, Radical Candor FAQs. Jason, what do you suggest I do if someone is using Radical Candor as an excuse to act like a jerk?
You should be a jerk right back.
That's right. You tell them.
Yeah. It is helpful when you feel, if someone is using Radical Candor as a shield. So an example of this might be saying, in the spirit of Radical Candor, and then behaving like a jerk. So let's say they invoke Radical Candor, but then they behave in what you think is an obnoxiously aggressive way, which is high on challenge directly and low on care personally. If someone did that to me, I might say exactly that. I might say, hey, I suspect that your intent was to be radically candid because that's what you said, but the way it came across to me was very high on challenge directly and low on care personally. And I think it's situation dependent, because if it was someone who reports to me, I probably wouldn't give them that feedback in the moment. I give people who report to me quite a lot of latitude in delivering
feedback.
Shut
up. Sorry, I couldn't help myself. That was my get free out of jail card.
Yeah,
just for those who are listening, I report to Jason.
But if it was a peer or if it was my manager, I probably would let them know that in addition to this is how it landed for me, that it's hard. Like when I feel like someone is being a jerk, it's harder for me to incorporate what they're saying, to take what they're saying and turn it into behavior. So if the goal of I want to support them in their goal of giving me some feedback, and I would just let them know like a helpful way to give feedback is to make sure that you're reasonably high up on care personally, where it feels like there's at minimum mutual respect. Because that, to me, that's the time that would be my trigger. It is like, it's not so much about just being a jerk or sort of maybe being obnoxious in the way that you deliver it, but if I feel like it's disrespectful, that's probably what would cause me to give someone this feedback.
What's going through my mind is wanting to edit what I said, because I would never actually be so obnoxious. And so it felt strange to even say it. And so one of the things that can be hard is if I might say something to you And right now we've got Brandy and Nick observing, and so they know me and they know our dynamic. But for a podcast audience who doesn't know me and how that might land, it becomes hard when, there might be part of why this becomes complex is the relationship that you and I have, where I could say something to you in a joking way, but how other people might be observing it. So I'm curious, like, just to use that specific example, like, how do you think about the idea that if it's measured not at my mouth, but at the listener's ear, knowing that there could be listeners who have never met me and they've just heard that for the first time, an attempt at humor could actually land really poorly?
Yeah, Amy, I think that's such a good that's such a good point. Like a lot of the time, we are working in a way that's observable by others, and I would say that even if it wasn't a joke, we want to be really thoughtful about that, because I remember when I was maybe like 2 years in at Khan Academy, my last job, and I had a really great relationship with my counterpart in the engineering team, and we would sometimes get into sort of disagreements where they would get heated. They weren't disrespectful, but they would get heated, and it made a lot of other people really uncomfortable. So neither of us felt like, oh, Jason or Ben is being a jerk. Like, we didn't feel like it was disrespectful. But for other people, it was disconcerting to see us arguing. And so like, I think it's really important when you think about when you are being observed to think about not only how the person you're talking to might receive it, but how other people who are observing it might perceive what you're saying.
Yeah, and I would never say "shut up" like to anyone. It's just not in my frame. And so I think it's such a good point about respect, and really part of why Kim wrote Radical Respect is really a prequel to that. So it's interesting as a tee up to our next question about observable behavior. And so right now we're doing this. We're able to see each other on video, and people are probably listening, and they're not getting the different body language and gestures. So the question is Radical Candor harder in a remote or hybrid work environment?
Since Radical Candor is based on your relationship, and I think relationships are harder to build when when there's no time spent together in person, I think by definition Radical Candor is harder. The antidote to that is to care a lot about those relationships and to intentionally spend time building them. Human beings, we evolved to live in small communities, like close together, physically close together, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like our hardware and software is reliant on that. Still, we haven't out evolved that state of being, and so it's valuable to recognize that more effort is required in that situation to make sure that especially the care personally is there, but also when we can't see each other, when we can't hear each other, especially when we can't hear each other, when we're communicating in text or something like that, there's so much that can be very easily misunderstood. And so the way that I think about this is, number one, invest the time to build a relationship, which means, spending time with that person outside of feedback conversations. Like, you don't want your only conversations where your relationship is like necessary for you to get your work done. You don't want the only conversations you have with them to be either like only tactical, meaning like only focusing on work output, or only sort of like outcome driven, where you're trying to get something from that other person. Like, you want to spend some time in the human relationship building element, which is like getting to know that person, what they like, what they don't like, how you can work better together with them. Those things are really important. And then I would go a step beyond that and say, I would make an extra effort to try to ensure that if I was giving feedback, especially critical feedback, that the care personally was coming through clearly.
Let me ask a couple follow-up questions on that. Do you have any specific tips for, I don't even know where to start. Like, how do I start to build the care personally, the relationship with someone? Maybe we're all virtual, or we're all so busy, or it's a new person. I'm just curious, do you have one practical tip for someone to start building that relationship?
to me, the most important thing is have one-on-one conversations with people that you work with regularly. I think this is a thing that, is generally considered to be in the purview of managers, but I think it is helpful to have like an out-of-band one-to-one conversation with the people you work with regularly, regardless of whether
Did you
they
say
report to you.
out of band?
Yeah, so like out of like the normal rhythm of work. So like, most people who are working on projects together, you probably have some kind of stand-up meeting and a status check-in and some kind of report out thing that happens at a regular basis. If those are the only times that you see the people that you work with regularly, it's going to be really hard to develop a relationship with those people as human beings. So I'm suggesting adding something to that, which is like one-on-one conversations with the people you work with most closely, whether or not they report to you. That's probably my number one recommendation for building relationships on a team that is entirely or largely remote or distributed.
Yeah, I think that's great. And do you have any follow-up on the distinction between remote, sort of purely remote versus hybrid?
The only thing I would say is, like, words matter here. If hybrid means some people work in the office and some people are fully remote, then I think my guidance is exactly the same. Like, it's really easy, actually. It's the most detrimental team setup that I've had for building relationships was when some people were in the office pretty much all the time and some people were remote pretty much all the time. That was like the worst possible setup, because the people who were remote often felt like the people who were together in the office didn't make enough of an effort to build a relationship with them. And on top of that, from like a purely practical, tactical work perspective, didn't do enough to make sure that they were included in work, like just a meeting, like let's say we're having a virtual meeting, but half of us were in an office, a conference room somewhere. We noticed that talk time was left mostly to the people who were in the room together. And a lot of people who were remote were excluded. I think what I would say is, like, be thoughtful about creating time when your work situation is in flux. So let's say you have some people who are in the office some of the time or in remote some of the time. Be thoughtful about making sure you have connection points, even if that's just at the beginning of a meeting, for example, like taking 5 minutes to check in and see how people are doing.
Knowing that everyone is unique, what have you found for you is an effective way for someone to reach out to you to schedule a one-on-one, especially like peer-to-peer maybe, or someone that you're working with, but they're not part of your day-to-day? I know a lot of folks struggle in our workshops with, well, I don't know how to reach out to this person, or that feels sort of weird. Like, why am I asking this person to meet? What works for you?
I haven't had quite the same experience, so I don't want to try to speak for them, but I'll share the approach that I've taken that has worked reasonably well for me. So, and your mileage may vary, I guess is what I'm saying. The approach that has worked reasonably well for me is just to state it as a fact, like, hey, our relationship is really important, and so at least for the duration of this project, I'd love to find a time where we can meet somewhat regularly. And usually, if the person doesn't report to me, I would say, like, once a month is probably fine for this kind of one-on-one check-in. Can we schedule 30 minutes once a month where we just where we check in, and it's an opportunity for us to solicit feedback from each other, check in and see how things are going from the other person's perspective, and just make sure that there isn't anything we can be or should be doing differently in order to make sure that we're happier, more successful working together. And people are pretty open to it. I don't think I've ever had someone say, no, I can't give you 30 minutes once a month.
I love that. I think that's great, and I think that gives people some really good food for thought. And as you say, your mileage may vary. You might run into someone that they're not necessarily bought into the value of building the relationship. Do you feel like if you get that feedback, is it just sort of like, okay, or have you found that maybe there's another way you could build a relationship with that person if a one-on-one doesn't seem to land?
Well, usually what I'll say is, like, well, this is a method that's worked for me. Like, I tend to think of our relationship, beyond the work, as being important, to give us an opportunity to get to know each other a little better, as being important. if it doesn't work for you, that's great. But is there something else that you've done to make sure that you're staying on the same page over the course of working together with someone who doesn't report to you? So I'd like ask a question and see if there's another way, if I could adapt my approach to that person. And if someone says, look, I don't see the value in spending time, like we have plenty of work meetings and all the other stuff, like I will usually, like I would imagine I would let that go, and until there was a moment in which I needed to have a conversation with that person, and then I might ask them again to say like, hey, this conversation might have been easier for us to have if we had some sort of regular check-in of some kind. Are you open to exploring that now?
That's great. In some ways, it's kind of like when we're on big projects, we have standing meetings. And if there's no business to share, then, we might just have a quick personal check-in, and that's sort of that. But to your point, at least it's there, and we can almost lean on that structure.
Yep.
Cool. Jason, how do you think Radical Candor works in a multi-generational workplace?
My reaction to that, as like having worked in several multi-generational workplaces, my reaction to that is that I think when we get that question, it's coming from a place of frustration and fear. Right? Because usually the subtext of that question is I can't give feedback to the older generation, or I can't give feedback to the younger generation. They're just not open to it. Or, I've tried to give feedback and it went terribly wrong, and I feel like now I have to like repair this relationship with a person who I don't have that much in common with or don't understand particularly well. What's missing usually is like the translation layer. So one of the things that we like to say all the time is that radical candor, if you abstract it out, like abstracts out to love and truth, and there isn't a culture on the planet that doesn't value love and truth. It's just like the way we express love and truth is going to vary from culture to culture. And I think generational differences are essentially cultural differences. Like that is the form that they take. We were literally raised in a different time and different place from each other. And on top of that, just like national cultures or ethnic cultures, generational cultures are not monoliths. So not every person who's a part of a particular generation is going to prefer the same things or dislike the same things. The way that I think about this is like, again, to be curious. So when I was like 25, I was given my first management role, and I was managing a team of people who were significantly older than I was on average. People in their late 30s and 40s. And I even had one team member who's in his 60s. So I had people who were at very different stages of their lives and careers, let alone generational differences. And the thing that I did that I think helped the most was to acknowledge it openly and to say like, hey, like we're all really different. We're coming from different places. We have different kinds of experience. My job is to make sure that we are collectively successful. And in order to do that, I need to make sure that I know how to communicate with each of you and all of you collectively. So I'm going to be going on a bit of a listening tour to figure out like what it is that you need from me as your manager, because you may have had a boss in the past who thought they needed, they had all the answers or they needed to have all the answers. Like I'm not that kind of a boss. Like I'm actually genuinely curious about what it is that you need from me in order to be successful. And just by naming that thing, I think it deflated a lot of the tension that existed, because there was a lot of expertise that I could tap into. And what I wound up doing was sort of following the order of operations and starting by soliciting feedback. And then as I got to know what people were really good at, like offering people some public praise to say, hey, we've got these experts on the team that we can rely on. And that acknowledgement of like the existence of knowledge and expertise went a really long way to helping to bridge the gap, the generational boundaries that might have existed in the way that people wanted to be communicated with. And on top of that, we got into the details of like, some people didn't text, some people texted all the time. So like we got into like basic communication thing of like, I had one of the guys on my team, he checked his email like once a day, right? Which was like weird to me because I was checking my email, a couple of times an hour probably. And he was one of my older employees, and he was like, I'm just not like, I'm not used to this. And for context, this job, we were working in a factory, basically. So checking email wasn't necessarily the easiest thing. Like people were often on their feet, up at machines, doing, working with machines and computers, but not at a desk at a personal computer. But I had to figure out how to do that. And so we had these standing meetings once a day where we literally got together physically in the plant to talk through, whatever issues were on the table for that day. And that was better than emailing everybody, since the use of email was uneven across the team.
Just to repeat what I've heard, there were a couple things that I thought really resonated. One is that we're really talking about different cultures, right? Like people were raised in a different place and time. But just like any other differences, Radical Candor is really all about individuals. So just reiterating that we don't want to be putting people in boxes. Oh, you're this generation or that generation, so therefore Radical Candor looks like this for you. It's really all about the individual. You talked about being curious and the actual value of naming the differences when you were coming in as a young boss and acknowledging the knowledge and expertise. I think that's so interesting that went a long way, because there's sort of this, well, back in the day, I had to, walk, in the snow to do this, et cetera. And so it kind of does a nod to that.
Kim and I are closer in age. There's no real generational difference between Kim and I. We're close enough in age that, we both lived before the internet, for example. Like that. I actually think that in an interesting way, more than generational boundaries, that's a pretty interesting difference. If you've only lived after the existence of the internet, it's kind of hard to imagine what life might be like without email. You know what I'm saying? We've lived without those things, and maybe we're in an interesting place where we sort of we can bridge those differences. But the further we get away from that, meaning for the folks who have lived always with the internet, or now always with social media, right? We have people entering the workforce for whom social media is has been around since they had consciousness of how to use technology. Those differences, there's knowledge and expertise that generation has that I don't have. Recognizing that exists is really valuable. And so, Kim and I answering these questions, I think the value there is, we've each had to navigate these things in our own careers, and hopefully there's a large enough surface area of advice here that it's helpful to others. Because I know this is a real challenge. I just want to recognize that I think there's some real pain associated with managing a cross-generational difference.
And I think acknowledging the knowledge and expertise, again, across the board, that people are going to bring different expertise because of that. You mentioned about communication differences, and we can drop in the show notes the conversation, Jason, that you and I had about sort of app overload and some of the history of email, which might be an interesting add-on. Before I move on from this question, one of the things that you said, the reason why this question tends to pop up is frustration. And the frustration that I've experienced quite a bit in workshops and other sessions is around this sense of people not having a sense of accountability, or there's this kind of lack of willingness to do sort of what is in the job description. And I usually feel that sometimes that just goes back to Radical Candor. Is it clear what good looks like? Has that been really clearly explained? But I'm curious if you've gotten any flavors of those questions around generational differences.
Yeah, to put it bluntly, I one thing I hear a lot is the new generation feels so entitled and they're unwilling. The younger generations feel so entitled and they're unwilling to do the work. And I think that is a symptom of maybe a more stark cultural difference, which is in my generation, a job was seen as a valuable thing that was given to the employee by the company. And I think in the generations that are coming into the workforce now, there's a deeper, especially in the West, there's a deeper questioning about whether or not that's true. Because the thing that I have noticed is that the younger generation tends to have this attitude, which is like, my labor is the valuable thing that I give to the company.
Mm-hmm.
That is there's like a fundamental perspective difference there of like where, who's the giver and who's the receiver of value in the employment relationship, that I think creates a lot of tension in those conversations. And I think there's a little bit of like, everybody's right here, right? Like, I think like the job is valuable. We live in a capitalist society. Like, you need income in order to like survive. So the job is clearly valuable. But I think for too long, that completely overrode the other perspective, which is like the labor, the energy and effort that people give to their companies is incredibly valuable. And we talk about these things in abstractions, right? We talk about how we want to reduce churn, right? Like how organizations want to reduce churn, which really means that we don't want to have to constantly rehire people, or organizations worry about things like brain drain, which is like, what if we lose a bunch of people who know lots of stuff about how the company works or how our products work or whatever it is. And really what we're saying is like, the energy, effort, and knowledge that our employees give to the company is incredibly valuable. And we should be prioritizing that and trying to retain as much of that as possible. But again, like, I think we can recognize it, like, on the one hand, and then sort of like forget in the moment when someone presents us a frustratingly different worldview about their relationship to work than the one we think they should quote in quotes have.
That is so well said. Well, I think that'll be a conversation we'll continue to explore. I want to close with two questions that are related to each other. So I'm going to put them together and you can choose to do them together or individual. One is, how can I be radically candid with my boss? And the related question, what if someone works in a toxic culture and their boss is unwilling to practice radical candor? Can it still be used, and how? So starting first, how can I be radically candid with my boss?
I think there are a couple of ways to think about giving radical candor to your boss, but I think it starts with remembering that your boss is a human being. Just like you have needs, wants, and desires for how you want to be cared about personally or challenged directly, they have those things also. So part of it is sort of trying to decode, what is it that my boss is looking for. I have found a useful tactic, especially if you're new to a role, you don't have a great relationship with your boss, is to appeal to your boss's enlightened self-interest. Like, this is a thing I talk about all the time, but appeal to your boss's enlightened self-interest, which is to say something to the effect of, I want to be the best, whatever it is, director of marketing that I can possibly be for you. I joined the company because I really care about what we're doing here. And in order to be the best, version of this, there's some things that, there are some ideas I have about how we might work together differently that would really help me accomplish that, right? If they're a good boss, so we're not talking about toxic relationships yet. If they're a good boss, they should want that also. And so that is one level of care personally. Like, I think if you know more things about your boss, or you've intuited some things about your boss's approach to their work, you could be more specific than that. You could say like, hey, I know how important it is, for us to all be singing from the same sheet of music. Maybe they've like used that metaphor before, like that being on the same page is something that they really value. And I had some pointers for you on ways that, we can more easily get on the same page, the same sheet of music. I think most bosses are open to that kind of feedback, right? They're open to this. Because you're not just asking something of them, you're giving them something back, and you're reminding them of the fact that if they change their behavior, they're going to get more from you, more value from you. So that's an effective way that I found. I think if I were to answer this from the Radical Candor sort of textbook, I would say, you might want to remember, like, think about the order of operations, like start by soliciting feedback and make sure to offer them some praise on the things that they're doing well. But I think if I wanted to fast forward that, I might take an approach like the one I just described.
Yeah, that's great. And you mentioned the important caveat of, this is a boss who wants to be a good boss. what about
and
that?
wants you to be successful, which is part of being a good boss.
Yeah. And so maybe that's good to be explicit about that we
Yeah.
believe part of being a good boss is wanting to make you successful. What about that person who feels like their boss is not willing to practice radical candor and they're in what they would describe as a toxic culture?
Look, it's not that is a crappy position to be in. I think there are a couple of things that I would usually I'm speaking from experience here. I've had the unfortunate experience of having several very toxic managers over the course of my career. A couple like where the toxicity was to the point where like it started to affect my health. It was like very, very challenging. And one of the things that I've realized is like that's priority number one. When you're in a toxic working environment, you have to figure out how you can stay healthy. That I mean, both mentally and physically, because there's no way to fix things. If you're burnt out, worn down, feeling completely defeated, you have no chance of getting things sort of back on the right track. So that was the thing number one, is like figure out what you need, put your oxygen mask on, like figure out what you need to do to feel reasonably healthy or well in that situation, and start doing those things as quickly as you can. Second thing is like start looking for options. That doesn't necessarily mean leaving the company or even leaving your manager, but start looking for what your options might be. Is it just your manager that's toxic, and like maybe there's another team that you could work for in the organization? That could be an option. And the way that I would start exploring that is finding out like, hey, has anybody ever switched teams here before? What did they do? How did that work? I'd be looking around for guidance from folks about how making a change like that might work. And if I decided like there's some chance that I think I could get things on the right track with my boss, the options I'd be looking for are like, who can I recruit to help me have this conversation with my manager? Maybe it's a person in HR, maybe it's a peer manager that you have a good relationship with, maybe it's another person on the team that seems to have a great relationship with your boss. But see if there are some options there to explore. And then last but not least, I wouldn't ignore the possibility of finding another job. Like sometimes like the cost, like the physical and mental cost of being in a toxic relationship is really not, there's really no way to justify it, even economically, to like continue down that path. And that was the position that I found myself in relatively early in my career, where I was making really, really good money. And I was literally like, I was 20 something years old, and I had like really high blood pressure and high cholesterol, and like was physically being killed by this job. Like if I had stayed there, eventually it would have literally killed me. My dad had a heart attack at 44 years old. So like I was on a direct path to something like that or worse. He survived that heart attack. And so I was like very conscious of that. And, you know, I was fortunate enough to have a good, a partner who was understanding. And I said, look, we're going to take a financial hit. I can't figure out a way to like keep the same salary. Like we might have to move or like change our situation. So it really wasn't easy to leave that job, but I did it. And I took a significant salary cut. We managed through through some downsizing and things like that to like make it work for a couple of years. And the good news is there's like pot of gold for me at the end of the rainbow. I wound up, 20 years later working for Radical Candor, having a great job and like an amazing team and a group of people. So there's hope also, as I think the message that I want to leave people with is like, even though that transition may be incredibly difficult, there is like the possibility of something better.
I really appreciate that story. And even just from that perspective of like, managers and bosses are people too. And just hearing the challenge and just, I imagine just being, having gotten to know you these past, like 7 years, but that those experiences have shaped you into the person that you are in terms of really leading with the empathy, the care, the focusing on the overall well-being of the people that work with and for you. So I'm sad that you had to go through that, and I think hopefully people listening to that will take some real inspiration, just knowing that there are other options and you're not alone. And I know that's a topic we've been talking about, on other podcasts. All right, before we wrap up, and Jason, just to give you a moment or two to prep, this is going to be a rapid fire round where I'm going to ask you the questions, but you're just going to do a sentence or at the most two, quick.
Okay.
I have to say, I still feel badly about telling you to shut up, even in jest. Just how I'm wired. It goes against every way that so I just have to name that sometimes in this sake of humor, we say things. So thank you for making it okay. But Brandy and Nick, as additional participants in the conversation, should we include it or not? Brandy
says keep it.
Okay.
It was hilarious, and it landed, and we all know you were joking, and it should stay.
Okay. All right. Well, I have been overruled, so thank you for the feedback. And now, listen up, everyone. It's time for our Radical Candor checklist. Okay, rapid fire. Jason, answering these questions as fast as you can. Question 1, what do you suggest I do if someone is using Radical Candor as an excuse to act like a jerk?
Let them know that their approach really isn't working for you and suggest that a way for them to show that they care personally.
Question 2, is Radical Candor harder in a remote or hybrid work environment?
It is, because it's harder to build relationships. Make the effort to make the time to build those stronger relationships by taking time to connect.
Question 3, how does Radical Candor work in a multi-generational workplace?
A multi-generational workplace is really the same thing as a multicultural workplace. So keep that sensitivity in mind and remember that each person is unique, and take it seriously to find a way to communicate with each of your team members in a way that shows them as individuals that you care personally and are willing to challenge them directly.
Question 4, how can I be radically candid with my boss?
Remember that your boss is a person too, and you can follow the order of operations. You can solicit feedback from them and offer them praise before you offer them criticism, or you can think of ways to appeal to their sense of enlightened self-interest and remind them that the feedback that you're giving them is helping them help you be successful.
Jerry Maguire, always helpful. Question 5, what if someone works in a toxic culture and their boss is unwilling to practice Radical Candor? Can it still be used, and how?
Radical Candor can be used in a toxic environment, but it's really important to start by putting your oxygen mask on. Make sure you're taking care of yourself. You're giving yourself enough time, space, and energy to actually practice Radical Candor. And if you discover that your efforts are unrewarded, start looking for options. Find the different ways that you can get out of that situation without putting yourself, your financial situation, your relationships outside of work, et cetera, in jeopardy.
Thanks, Jason. For more tips, visit radicalcandor.com/resources, and show notes for this episode are at radicalcandor.com/podcast. Praise in public, criticize in private. So if you like what you hear, we hope you do, please rate and review us wherever you're listening to this podcast. And if you've got criticism, we welcome that too. You can email it podcast@radicalcandor.com. And again, these were Jason's questions. Go ahead, check out, if you haven't heard them, Kim's answers to these same questions. Bye for now. The Radical Candor podcast is based on the book Radical Candor, Be a Kick-Ass Boss Without Losing Your Humanity by Kim Scott. Episodes are written and produced by Brandy Neal, with script editing by me, Amy Sandler. The show features Radical Candor co-founders Kim Scott and Jason Rosoff and is hosted by me, still Amy Sandler. Nick Carissimi is our audio engineer. The Radical Candor podcast theme music was composed by Cliff Goldmacher. Follow us on LinkedIn, Radical Candor the company, and visit us at radicalcandor.com.